In this lecture, I wish to give viewers an introduction to what I see as the essential points of Shintou, which is the indigenous spiritual tradition of Japan. I want to first and foremost say that I am not an ordained kannushi, which is what you call the priest, essentially, in a Shinto shrine. There has been at least one kannushi who's been ordained from the West, but I am not him. So with that in mind, I want you to always defer to those who are actually ordained and certified in the Shinto tradition over me. I can only pass on information that I've learned through reading and through my experience listening to and talking with some who are or have been involved in the tradition. So take this as my understanding, which can always be refined and deepened. Now, before we get into any of the real core of the study, I feel the need to give some disclaimers. Reading about this stuff will probably make you want to visit Japan or visit again if you have already been. And that's perfectly fine. But recently Japan has been straining under the influx of mass tourism. Now, I'm not going to tell you not to go to Japan. It would be hypocritical of me to do so. But I am going to ask that you please do your best to be a good tourist. And so I'm going to front load this video with some advice that you can heed, and in doing so immediately be ahead of many, many visitors to the country if you decide to take a trip there. Number one, learn as much of the language as you can. You don't have to be fluent, but knowing some will help. The most important things to know will probably be related to shopping and to restaurants. Number two, this is an awkward one that no one really talks about, but if you are of European descent or Middle Eastern or Indian or somewhere with more body hair than Asian people that get kind of smelly underarms after a long time, pack your deodorant in bulk because Japanese deodorant sucks. It doesn't work at all for people like us who are not Asian. And you don't want to be smelly, so make sure you bring your own deodorant. Number three, dress like you have a job interview. You can wear shorts or a t-shirt if it's the summer because it's going to be hot and you don't want to sweat more than you have to. But try to be at least a little fashionable because you'll probably feel underdressed because they dress really nice over there. I think this isn't my favorite element of being over there. I think fashion is kind of stupid and we care too much about it, but I do try to dress my best, and I think it's important too. Number four, don't eat or drink while walking. This is considered rude. And yes, you are not supposed to drink on the move, even though there are vending machines on every street corner. If you get a drink from that machine, you are expected to either take it for later or stand in front of the machine and drink the whole thing right there, which can actually be a nice way to just kind of take a break and refresh your mind. And definitely never drink or eat on the subway or train. Speaking of which, number five, don't speak loudly on trains or buses. The more silent you can be, the better. Try not to take up too much space either. Try not to use your phone in public, and especially not on the train or subway. That's like a never. But out on the street, you can use it, but try to speak quietly and go into a quiet corner kind of on the side of the street if you can. Number six, always ask before taking pictures or videos. Satsue shite mo ii desu ka? Satsue shite mo yoroshii desu ka? Something like that is a good phrase to remember. And don't include people in them you don't know if you can help it, especially children. If you're the kind of person watching this video, I probably don't need to tell you not to do some stupid TikTok dance, but yeah, if you do that, I hate you. And number seven, be on your best behavior at shrines and temples, and that's where I'm going to go into a bit more detail here about proper etiquette at a shrine or a temple. Definitely don't touch or take anything or take pictures of anything without permission. Okay, so if a result of this video is sending more visitors to Japan, I feel that at the very least I should convey these messages as well in order to hopefully make it easier on the country absorbing these visitors. Let's all be on our best behavior and show Japanese people that not all tourists are disrespectful morons. Also, I will say that you should not feel like you're somehow less worthy or no less or less spiritually enlightened if you don't have a chance to go to Japan. I despise that so many people act like their travel experiences make them better than others when they really don't. I've met many total ignoramuses who have been to Japan and lived in Japan, and many people who haven't been there who I think are much more smart and in many cases much more quote-unquote Japanese, whatever that means. So while I think it's fine to want to visit Japan, just be honest about your intentions and don't feel like you need to understand and respect Shinto, for example. Alright, with that in mind, I'm going to get into the lecture. Thank you. If you look the term up in a dictionary, Shinto is described as the indigenous religion of Japan. And this is not an inaccurate definition, but there is a lot of things about it that are misleading, especially if we compare Shinto to religions like Buddhism or Christianity. To explain a bit about why that is, and also to understand Shinto in a more authentic way, we need to give an overview of where the term came from, and also what the history of religion in Japan has looked like. This is a highly abbreviated account with a lot of important points left out, but I still aim to reduce confusion by being thorough. So the word Shinto is made up of two kanji, one for kami, or gods. I'm going to use the word kami exclusively in referring to the deities or gods being worshipped in Shinto, because I think I want to make sure we're understanding it in an authentic way and reduce associations with the word God we might have in a Western context. So one of them is kami, and the other one is for way. Literally, it's path. In that sense, Shinto literally means the way of the kami, or the way of the gods. Those in all sorts of traditions often use the metaphor of a spiritual path to describe the religious life, but the truth is that we should be wary of this tendency to view the way of the gods as something distant or removed and connected to withdrawal from and disdain for a normal existence. Because the kanji michi, which is pronounced as to in Shinto, but more commonly do, literally means path, but it is used in a very prosaic sense in the description of many other activities and forms of everyday know-how in Japanese. For example, shodo is the word for calligraphy, or the way of writing. Budo is the term for martial arts, or the way of arms. See also many individual martial arts like judo, aikido, and kendo that have the same etymology of ending in do. Kyudo for archery, the way of the arrow. Kado for flower arrangement, the way of flowers. Sado for tea ceremony practices, the way of tea. So, in the perspective of many modern religions, like Buddhism or Christianity, it might seem strange to merely think of spiritual practice as a kind of know-how, on the same level as knowing how to play an instrument. But this is a modern imposition. The entire conception of religion as something meant to be separated from life and delimited as a more elevated form of transcendent activity is a modern idea which is not borne out in the entire history of even just the Western world. Nor does it mean that it drags down spiritual practices to the lowly level of the everyday, but I think should be understood more as viewing these other forms of life and practice, like calligraphy and martial arts and flower arrangement, as having a nobility of their own, which isn't so disconnected from quote-unquote higher religious practices. There's some notable overlap in this conception of know-how with Heidegger's discussion of techne, and you can view my lecture on later Heidegger to understand that more fully. The ancient Japanese did not use the word Shinto to refer to the rites and customs in which they related to the kami, or gods around them. They did not even have a word like religion to refer to it. Nor is this solely a unique quirk of Japan. We see the same lack of this concept in most pagan societies, like ancient Greece, and many Native American tribes, and so on. When you read about the ancient Greeks and Romans, they often expressed a sort of intolerance about the barbaric religious practices of other groups like the Gauls or Carthaginians. But note the important distinction. They disapproved of different practices, like human sacrifice, not different religions. If you ask them to distinguish the quote-unquote religion of the Gauls and the religion of the Greeks and Romans, the question wouldn't even make sense. They were all just practicing the way of the gods. It would be like a disagreement in musical customs. They could have very different instruments, but they were all playing music with them at the end of the day. The concept of religion does not even emerge with the dominance of Christianity in the West. For the medieval Christians, there was still nothing like religion. There was only truth and various forms of ignorance and heresy. Religion is an Enlightenment-era idea. It's a term people have used to try to isolate these systems of practice and belief from the stuff that really matters, like laws and government and ethics, etc., in their view, for the sake of creating tolerant, pluralistic societies and still respecting the cultural importance of potentially incompatible sources of dogma. Such was the story in the West that led to the creation of the concept of religion. It sounds strange to say it, but religion is a term that implies a kind of disagreement, even if in a tolerant and respectful fashion. Religion is always what those superstitious people do, not what we rational people do. The story in Japan, however, is completely different. The inhabitants of Japan have been doing spiritual rituals and holding spiritual beliefs for as long as we have records of them. But around the late 6th century AD, the Japanese began to trade and exchange information with the surrounding kingdoms on the continent more regularly, usually via the Korean peninsula. It was during this time that Buddhism was first introduced to Japan, after it had found its way to China and Korea from India and Central Asia. Other Chinese influences like Confucianism and Taoism came along with it. Of course, none of these isms existed back then. The transition was not an easy one. Many at the time rejected Buddhism as a destructive, evil, foreign religion. But the story goes that the kami were asked and officially sanctioned Buddhism as something to introduce to the Japanese archipelago. After all, there seemed to be nothing inherently contradictory in the practice of the two at first glance. Buddhism had made room for indigenous gods and the worship of them when it swept through India, China, and Korea, so there was no reason to think that it couldn't do the same thing in Japan. A standard conception to make sense of this pluralism is the idea of honchi suijaku, which is to say that the kami worshipped in Japan were in truth gongen, or incarnations of Buddhas in another form, in order to benefit the Japanese in particular. Some have also preferred the reverse formation called han honchi suijaku, saying that in fact the Buddhas were merely kami in disguise designed to benefit those overseas instead. The pluralist conception resulted in some 1,000 years of syncretism. Most religious centers in Japan were full of native kami being worshipped next to Buddhas and monks, and the coexistence was by and large a peaceful one. That doesn't mean that Japan itself was wholly peaceful. In fact, the 15th and 16th centuries in Japan consisted of almost constant civil war, and religious institutions would quite often be involved in these quarrels. But these wars were primarily of a political nature rather than a religious one, and the little religious fighting that didn't occur usually occurred as internecine fights among Buddhists, not between Buddhists and Shintoists. But in the late 1500s, a very different religion emerged on Japan's shores: Christianity. Strange, blue-eyed men who stank like butter arrived from the West. They said that they came from a faraway land called Portugal. One thing was certain: they would be useful if nothing else for their scientific knowledge, which had far outpaced that of the Japanese. In conversing with these Portuguese, the aristocracy learned quite a lot about navigation, astronomy, and, most importantly, firearms. For this reason, these padres were quite useful for a shogun to have in his court, but there was a price to pay. They were spreading a religion called Christianity, which taught that all native Japanese religions were false and heretical. This alien religion from the West threatened to destroy the entirety of Japanese society. Christianity was outlawed in the early 1600s, and the entire country of Japan was soon closed to the rest of the world to prevent the further erosion of society and tradition by foreign religions and cultures. This sakoku period of closure was not marked by total ignorance of the outside world, nor by complete hatred of it. Foreign influences continued to enter the country, though at a slower and more regulated pace. Calvinist merchants from the Netherlands proved less interested in mass conversion of the Japanese population, and so were allowed to have special access to a port in Nagasaki, where they brought European goods as well as European learning. However, that learning was to be strictly limited to science and technology, with no potentially subversive cultural or spiritual elements. An interesting aside, the only non-scientific work of Western literature which seemed to have been translated at this point was Aesop's Fables. Buddhist monks were also often allowed special trips to China for the sake of religious learning. It wasn't uncommon for young, curious men to join the temple merely for the sake of experiencing this novelty of travel to foreign lands. This is the circumstance in which the term Shintou came into being. The desire to isolate Japanese culture and society from the rest of the world had to sustain itself by a special question. What was Japanese culture? What was Japanese society? What did Japan have that was distinctive and indigenous, and not merely inherited from China, India, or more recently, the West? This constellation of spiritually Japanese tradition began to be labeled Shinto, in contrast to the Buddhism, Confucianism, and Christianity that had become entangled with it over the years. This was not merely a scholarly intellectual movement. It had popular grassroots support. One effect of outlawing Christianity was a requirement for all Japanese citizens to nominally join a local Buddhist temple. All of Japan became Buddhist. Of course, this was not strictly monitored. It was more of a way that the government rooted out hidden Christians. Most leaders didn't care whether the adherents went to a temple regularly or supported one monetarily. They just cared about proving that you were not a Christian. That said, not all temples were so benign. Many leaders of temples realized that they had a great opportunity to exploit peasants, force the peasants to pay, or they would report them as Christians to the shogun and they would be executed. Lots of corruption seeped into the Buddhist institutions as a result of being so powerful. This fueled a nationalistic, anti-Buddhist movement which sought to destroy Buddhist institutions and expel Buddhism as a foreign corrupting religion. But wait, if these people were not Buddhists, but also not Christians, what were they? This is where the term Shinto began to emerge as an alternative to both. It was what was left after you stripped away the influences from overseas. In 1854, the American officer Matthew Perry put an end to Japan's isolationist period via a sort of forceful gunboat diplomacy. The Japanese world shook. A new era had dawned. The Meiji Restoration occurred, which essentially constitutes the creation of the modern Japanese state. On the one hand, the Meiji Restoration was horrifying to the most staunchly conservative Japanese. The country westernized at a rapid pace. Some 2 centuries worth of closed-off political and technological reform seemed to now flood Japan in an instant. Japan became rapidly westernized both in society and government. However, the Meiji Restoration also made Japan much more Japanese than ever before in a politically nationalistic sense. That is, the emperor finally became the central figure of Japanese politics again. This had not been the case since the Heian period, which ended in 1185. For over 500 years, Japan had been ruled by shoguns from the military class. It was also under Meiji that the religious policy of Japan massively changed. Japan adopted the policy of freedom of religion, like other Western countries. Christianity was officially legalized, but more importantly, Buddhism was defined as a religion, just like Christianity, and was no longer intertwined with the state. But something else was put in its place, Shinto. The framers of the Meiji Constitution did not put Shinto on the same level as other religions like Buddhism or Christianity. They did not see it as a religion. Shinto now became interpreted as an apparatus of the state, as the emperor was divine. It became nationalistic rather than religious. Shinto was Japanese culture and spirit itself. To be a Japanese was to be a Shintoist and vice versa. As a part of this, the policy of Shinbutsu Kakuri was introduced, which did not allow the now government-owned Shinto shrines to be connected to Buddhist institutions. These had to be separated, and you can see remnants of this today in Japan. A lot of Shinto shrines are right next door to Buddhist temples. In most cases, they were probably originally part of the same complex, but had to be isolated during the Meiji Restoration. This so-called state Shinto would, however, meet an untimely end. It was the ideology which propelled Japan to become a fascist state in World War II. When the war was lost, Emperor Showa was forced to give his famed Ningen Sengen, or Humanity Declaration. In it, he explained that his role was to merely be one of trust and admiration. He claimed that he was not in fact divine, nor were the Japanese any more divine or destined for supreme rule than any other race in the world. State Shinto was officially outlawed, and Shinto was finally set apart as one religion among others in the country. It was one with a particularly central and important cultural history to the country, to be certain, but no longer one to be tied to the state. The emperor's position would become like that of the royal families of England and other European constitutional monarchies, an important cultural, and we might even say spiritual figurehead, but no longer one with institutionalized political authority. In this case, we can see how the whole idea and label of Shinto is itself a new concept. It is now considered a religion in the Western sense, but only after having been through a strange journey to get there, usually more as a reaction to external circumstances than anything internal. In its most original primal conception, Shinto was no religion at all. It had no founder, no holy texts, and no prescribed beliefs. There were only customs, practices, and teachings. Shinto could not be disentangled from other elements of Japanese culture and society any more than traditional forms of music and art could. When you actually talk to people who work at shrines in Japan, they will rarely use the word Shinto or say, "I'm a Shintoist." In fact, many of them have Buddhist altars in their private houses next to their kamidana, meaning a kind of household shelf or tiny shrine with offerings to certain kami. Here, I aim to make the case that the recognition of Shinto as something distinct from other traditions, like Buddhism, is legitimate and important, and I claim that it is one of the most pure and ideal forms of spiritual practice on Earth today. But I also aim to make the case that it is not unique. It is unique in the sense that it is tied to the customs, history, and landscape of Japan, but it is not unique in that it represents something alien to the rest of the world. I believe, rather, that something like Shinto is the form that all spiritual practices would have if they never became organized religions in the manner of Christianity and Buddhism. If the Native Americans and pagan Europeans were left alone by Christianity, they would have something very much like Shinto as their so-called religion. That is to say, as a form of know-how involving gods, fully intertwined with all the other rituals and events of their daily existence, bringing a higher elevation of refinement and spiritual awareness to them. Now that we know a bit about what Shinto is not, we should talk about what actually makes up these traditional rites and beliefs. Shinto is not a faith into which one is initiated. It is one into which one grows organically, as part of culture and customs, and as such, it always has a strongly local character. What an individual manifestation of Shinto looks like can look as different as the rites and customs of different cities in any major country. Even a country as densely populated as Japan has these distinctions. In this lecture, however, I can sketch out some broad themes that are for the most part the same of Shinto no matter where you are in Japan. The three terms, polytheism, animism, and nature worship, are often used interchangeably to refer to Shinto. All three are correct descriptions, but all three of these have slightly different definitions that don't necessarily imply each other. Shinto is a Venn diagram of all three, and so we should spell out what these three mean in my definition. Polytheism simply means that Shintoists believe that there is more than one god, just like the ancient Greeks, Egyptians, and most other societies before the aberration known as the Abrahamic religions were born. In fact, their pantheon puts most others to shame. The traditional set phrase to indicate the endless myriad of gods in the world is Ya-Orodzu no Kami, which literally means the 8 million kami, or gods. This does not mean that there are literally 8 million gods. Since there was no word for or conception of infinity in ancient Japan, the number 8 million here is used as a metaphor to signify that there are an infinite, uncountably large number of kami. Shinto enshrines and pays tribute to many kami, including many individual human beings who have become apotheosized after death, all canonized pre-humanity declaration, of course. Animism refers to the belief that all things, including material objects like stones or trees or so on, have spirits or anima inside of them. That is, there are no truly inanimate objects. Shinto is a species of animism. It's believed in Shinto that all things have a kami of their own. Shinto does not have a proscribed metaphysics, so the exact nature of this is left open-ended. It is not clear, for example, if each individual thing actually is its spirit to the degree that we are our minds, or if some closer to inanimate things like stones rather have a sort of guardian angel-like kami who animate them and are responsible for them, or perhaps both. Colloquial Japanese speech talks of gods of abstract properties like gods of love, of wealth, of computer security, of well-developed boobs, and so on, which seems to indicate that the latter is certainly a possibility in at least some cases. In any case, the animism of Shinto is decidedly pluralistic, unlike the animism of some tribes who believe that all things are animated by an identical sort of spirit stuff that flows through everything, like the Polynesian concept of mana, or the Haudenosaunee, aka Iroquois, conception of Orinda. Lastly, Shinto is a form of nature worship, and this again is not an uncommon pattern in polytheism. Most polytheistic societies have gods that are related to natural phenomena like wind, rain, sun, harvests, and so on, and Shinto is no exception. Most all rites somehow revolve around reverence of the natural world and a desire to exist in harmony with it. If there is one thing that most immediately bounds Shinto and sets up its form in the modern day, it is the jinja, or shrine. There are some 80,000 shrines in Japan today, though this number is even fewer than there used to be, as many were merged and consolidated under the Meiji Restoration. In simplest terms, a shrine is a place where the kami is enshrined. This is once more an important point that separates a shrine from a church, mosque, or Buddhist temple. It is not a place that is set up primarily for social worship and religious community, but it is not merely the residence of its kami either. Kami do not sit idly around waiting for worshippers. They are active in the world and instantiated in phenomena. The shrine is more of a symbolic dwelling, one where the kami can make itself or one aspect of itself manifest for worship and communion. You should be on excellent behavior at shrines or temples, and the most important part first is knowing the difference to use the right terminology. A shrine is a Shinto establishment which enshrines and houses native Japanese kami. A temple is a Buddhist establishment which is meant for Buddhist religious practices. This can be confusing because in English we often use the words shrine or temple interchangeably to refer to ancient Greco-Roman religious sites, but they refer to very different traditions in Japan. Japan is a very syncretic country, so it's not like people will think you're being blasphemous if you call a shrine a temple or vice versa, but it is a step to show respect, and what is correct behavior at a shrine is not always so at a temple and vice versa. You can remember this with a mnemonic because shrines are Shinto. They both start with an SH. The typical shrine today consists of an ornate building with several distinctive architectural features. Its pathway is marked by a torii, which is a large red wooden gateway. Entering the torii is the first place where one prepares one's heart to be deferent and open to all that is numinous and sublime. We also often find traditional rock lanterns and statues of komainu or lion dogs near the torii or on the pathway around it. These are meant to be a kind of protective figure to ward off menacing spirits in the same manner as gargoyles and other grotesques on Western churches. When you approach a shrine and pass through the torii, you should walk on the side of the path and avoid the direct middle. The direct middle is reserved for the kami to walk on. This applies for the entire path to the main hall of the shrine as well, but sometimes this is harder to maintain, especially if it's crowded. Before you enter the torii, give a bow. When exiting from the torii, turn back and give a bow on your way out. The central building has a hemp rope made of rice straw called a shimenawa. Shimenawa are made out of rice stalks. We rarely see fully grown rice stalks these days, but rice, being the staple of all Japanese diets, is a food which is essential to all life and existence. The straw floors in many shrines are also made of the same material. There will often be white, zigzag-shaped paper streamers called shide hanging from the shimenawa. When entering a shrine, you will also have to purify yourself by washing your hands at the chozuya, or water pavilion. The fancier shrines will have a full setup with a flowing spout and ladles. When at one of these, take a ladle full of water. You should use only one ladleful for the entire process. Then, you hold the ladle in your right hand and pour water into your left palm. You switch the ladle to your washed left hand and pour water into your right palm. You pour water then into your left palm, rinse your mouth with some water from it, but do not drink it. Let the water fall out of your mouth onto the ground in the most discreet way that you can. Definitely don't spit it out, making a gross sound or anything. Then pour water back onto your left palm again, and turn the ladle upright so that the remaining water rinses the handle. Empty the ladle on the ground and put it back. Some shrines will just have a running spout of water with no ladle, and if that is the case, use your palms as a ladle to the best ability that you can. The central building will also often, although not always, have ornamentation on their roofs called chigi and katsuogi. Shrine roofs are gabled and feature forks called chigi at the edges that point out at the edge of the roof, looking sort of like horns. Along the gable, there are logs laid on top in a perpendicular fashion called katsuogi. Many shrines will also have a sort of yard which is cordoned off by a fence to delimit a space of earth where the kami makes itself manifest. The fence is called a himorogi. It usually has a sakaki tree either set at each of its four corners or in the middle. Some of these areas are left barren, while some have an object in the center, such as a tree, rock, or even animal in some cases. The object in this case is called a yorishiro, which is an object that attracts a kami to its place, like a sort of spiritual antenna, to use a phrase from Yamakage Motohisa. A himorogi, and indeed a shrine itself, is a kind of yorishiro, of course. All shrines will have a goshintai, which literally means a god's body. This is a central object in their main halls, which stand in as a sign of the kami. In many cases, this is a mirror. The mirror is not itself thought to be the kami, but to represent it through its clarity and purity. Some very special and old shrines do not use a mirror as an object, but rather build the entire shrine around the goshintai itself, usually when the goshintai is too large or too embedded in the surrounding scenery to be removed. These goshintai are usually things like particularly magnificent mountains, rocks, trees, and bodies of water. This is especially common at some of Japan's oldest shrines, which gives us a hint that the oldest forms of Shinto practice may have predated the establishment of a building around the goshintai itself. You are encouraged to make a prayer at the shrine. The way it works is that you bow twice, throw in a coin, optionally. Any coin is fine, but it's best to do only one. It's impolite to use it as a place to dump all your change. Then clap twice, say your prayer silently. They say that if you don't live in Japan, you should tell the kami your address in your country so they can find you. And then bow once. The clapping is very important. In fact, the oldest record of Japan from China back to around 57 AD, even then note the practice of clapping twice during prayers in the Japanese. It's that ancient of a custom, apparently. But you should not do it at a temple. I've seen people do this going to a Buddhist temple, praying, and then clapping like at a shrine. It's not considered blasphemous necessarily, but you'll stick out and look a bit silly if you do, probably. So, just a warning if you're visiting. Like all spiritual institutions, shrines are staffed. The main figure in charge of a shrine is known as a kannushi. The term literally means a master of gods in the sense of a master of ceremonies. The clothes he wears are not necessarily tied to the religion on their own, but are simply the clothes of nobles from the Heian period. The typical outfit will consist of a joe, a light robe, generally colored white, made of linen or silk, hakama, streaming trousers that reach down to the ankles, eboshi, a pointed mesh cap made of silk or hemp that is dyed black, a shaku, a flat scepter made of smoothly carved wood, which serves a richly decorative purpose today, but originally was used as a tablet for recording notes, and an onusa, a wand usually made from the branch of a sakaki tree with white shide hanging from it. A commonly seen form of onusa with only two shide is called a gohei. These are used in purification rituals. Young females called miko are also a common sight at most shrines of decent size. Female figures in Shinto have traditionally had a role of performing roles like shamans, mediums, diviners, and other sacred roles. This role has eroded over the years, and miko do not take as much of a central role in worship and ritual today. But their ancient role is hinted at in the performance of the kagura dance, which is a sort of dance in which the miko becomes a yorishiro and becomes almost possessed, as it were, by the kami during it. Before the Meiji Restoration, miko also used to serve as sacred prostitutes and offer sexual favors in exchange for money at shrines. Traditionally, kannushi and miko would achieve their positions hereditarily. Today, this is no longer institutionalized. To become a kannushi today, one must study at a special university and become certified. There are two major ones, Kokugakuin Daigaku in Tokyo and Kogakkan Daigaku in Ise. Despite this, it is common to see a lineage with a family business of owning a shrine. Women can also become kannushi today. For miko, the conditions are less strict. In fact, it's very common for young high school or college girls to become Miko as a part-time job. There is no belief required for this position. This is a strong difference from the Abrahamic religions, and even perhaps from Buddhism, but it is actually a pretty common state of affairs from an ancient religious standpoint. The famed orator Cicero from ancient Rome gives us an example. Cicero was employed as an augur, meaning someone who divined things from the flight paths of birds. Cicero, however, made it clear that he did not believe in augury at all. He didn't think it was a legitimate way to divine the future. But that didn't matter. The divinations simply had to be done, no matter if the vessel doing them believed or not. Most duties of Miko are similar, and so it is not uncommon for girls with no spiritual beliefs at all to become Miko. You can even see foreign exchange students do it sometimes over the holidays. What actually happens at one of these shrines, then? What do the Kannushi and Miko, and the laity for that matter, actually do that entails Shinto? A lot of it comes down to stewardship. Shrines are kept clean and orderly, but also allow nature to present itself. So there is a lot of sweeping, trimming of plants, and so on. Shrines are above all meant to be places that preserve a special majesty, and so they must be kept clean and orderly. But there is more that goes on in them than something like a mere park or garden. The local character of shrines entails that the details about these things are as varied as the many different festivals and traditions across the Japanese archipelago are. Most Japanese festivals are somehow supported and sustained by shrines. The busiest time of year for any shrine is usually New Year's, which is the most important holiday in Japan. Today it's celebrated according to the Western calendar on December 31st to January 1st, but it used to follow the old lunar Chinese calendar and occur at the beginning of spring. Like in many cultures, the New Year represents transition, rebirth, purification, and so on. Japanese have a custom of visiting a shrine at the end and beginning of the year. Many will traditionally hang out at the shrine itself until midnight and then proceed towards the main hall of the shrine to make a prayer for the new year and buy a fortune. And drink lots of sake. This much is what every Japanese knows and is the very basic acquaintance with Shinto you will have as a Japanese person by mere cultural osmosis. But it does reflect some of the deeper, important elements of the faith. There are still a lot of Chinese influences on the calendar in the Shinto world, as many divination methods involving the sexagenary cycle to predict lucky and unlucky days, years, and other such taboos are core in many Shinto practices. But not all of this is a slavish imitation of the Chinese system. One can find out how to deal with these taboos. Shrines have a lot of things you can buy for protection, fortune, commemoration, and so on. But these are more of additions to the main center of Shinto practice. Only larger shrines have them, and they are more of an addition for the enjoyment and pleasure of others on top of the real core of Shinto. That isn't to say that they are by any means a gimmick, because the enjoyment and pleasure of others is central to spirituality and worship, but they are not essential to a shrine being a shrine. Much of the above is more of an aside to the real center of Shinto practice, and that can be broadly summed up in the word purification. Everything in Shinto revolves around becoming pure and clean in body, mind, and spirit. The general term for this is harae. For a religion without any proscribed sins, one might wonder what all the emphasis on purity is about. What are we becoming pure of? Well, Shinto does not prescribe specific sins, but that certainly doesn't mean that it doesn't recognize that they can exist. It is simply left more open to the practitioner and the kami what those sins to purify are. I use the word tsumi, or sin here, which is a common word in a Shinto context, but in order to avoid linking it too much with the Christian conception of sin, a related word that makes it easier to understand is kegare, which is better translated as defilement or impurity. Kegare can be thought more broadly as any kind of defiling or dirty spiritual stuff, and the connection with physical defilement is intentional, which is why a lack of both are prized at a shrine. When we wash away a bit of our physical dirtiness in the water, our spiritual dirt also falls off. Kegare is more generally any kind of spiritual grime. And though there isn't an official cosmology of something like demons in Shinto, it is believed that there are unclean spirits that can be responsible for at least some of this defilement, which is why you always have to call the venerable Kannushi in the Japanese ghost story, like you do the exorcist in the Western one. Also, the fear over kegare is the reason that menstruating women traditionally were not allowed on shrine grounds. There are many ways that we are purified in Shinto practice. Some of them I have already touched on. The rinsing of our hands and mouth with water is a form of purification that we do upon entrance to the shrine grounds. I also mentioned that the onusa, or wand, is a standard part of the Kannushi's attire, and it is a ritual implement which is in the end used to purify people and objects before they partake in any ceremony. This usually, of course, consists of just waving the wand in front of the worshipper, who bows their head before it. Water is a common element of purification. Ritual bathing, drinking, washing, etc. is a common feature in Japanese myths. In fact, it might be one of the most central symbols of purification in religion. What is a baptism if not something like this? One form of this purification is called misogi, which is most typically practiced by standing under a waterfall wearing nothing but a fundoshi or loincloth, but a more beginner-friendly version simply consists of drinking the water. One Shinto kannushi, Yamakage Motohisa, suggests that misogi may have originally been practiced in the ocean. He argues that the most activities in Shinto seem to have evolved out of a more primal sort of being in nature. Some particularly important purifications will have people rub dolls over their body in order to channel out the bad energy. You can think of it kind of like a reverse voodoo doll, meant to absorb and take away the bad stuff instead of inducing it. Traditionally, these were full-blown dolls made of wood and cloth, but recently they are simple white paper cutouts of a human shape. They are traditionally cast into rivers or oceans after being used, so the shift to easily biodegradable paper has prevented the accumulation of trash. Salt is another substance which has special purifying powers in Shinto. The symbolism of it is of course similar to rice and water, as salt is one of the staple substances that humans need to consume in order to live. Salt is often placed in a pile as an offering to the kami along with water or sake. Sometimes salt is sprinkled over people before partaking in a ceremony, or a bit may be offered to eat. One of the areas you see this most commonly is in a sumo wrestling match, where wrestlers sprinkle salt around the ring before fighting as a way of purifying it. Sumo wrestling actually originated as a Shinto ritual, and is still considered to be one in spite of becoming a spectator sport on top of that. It's why the ref is often seen in a kannushi wear. It's also why no women are allowed in the ring. A while ago I saw a case where a female paramedic ran into the ring to try to help one of the wrestlers who was in pain, and even she was harshly scolded. Old school rules. Prayers are an important part of Shinto. Like many other religions, there are both individual silent prayers and prescribed ritual words of worship. There is a metaphysical importance to this. The word kotodama literally means something like word spirit, and it is believed in Shinto that the actual sounds of words carry a power of their own, and that they have the power to influence both the mind of the practitioner and the matter of the world around them. For that reason, many of the most important liturgical norito, or prayers addressed to a specific kami, have a power when read which is deeply affecting. The belief in the spiritual power of word sounds and vibrations is also the root for many Japanese superstitions based on homophones. The number 4, shi, sounding similar to the word for death, shi, is a well-known example, and is why a lot of Japanese stores don't have 4th floors. But there are positive examples as well. For example, it's a common belief that a 5-yen coin, go-en, is lucky to donate to a shrine because it sounds like go-en, or fate, or connection. Of course, shrines existed before the yen currency did, so this itself is not an ancient belief, but it reflects the ancient belief in kotodama. Another nice example, sometimes shrines sell amulets in the shape of frogs, because the word for frog, kaeru, is a homophone for the word to return, kaeru. So they are seen as lucky charms for a safe return. This was more common when the pilgrimage to a shrine was a particularly arduous ordeal. While we are discussing norito, I will here read 2 of the most common ones with translations on screen. First, harae no kotoba, the most common text which most kannushi will read before a service. Kakemaku mo kashikoki izanagi no okami tsukushi no himuka no kachibana no odo no awagihara ni misogi harae tamaishi toki ni narimaseru harae do no okami tachi moromoro no magagoto tsumi kegare aramu oba harae tamai kiyome tamae to mosu koto o kikoshimese to kashikomi mo mosu. Next, the o harae no kotoba, which is a longer text, which is also common but takes more time and effort to read and memorize because it is much longer, which goes as follows. 高間の原にかむつまります。すめらがむつかむろぎかむろみのみこともちて。やろずの神たちよ、かむつどえにつどえたまい、かむはかりにはかりたまいて。あがすめみまのみことは豊足原の水をの国を靖国と平けくしろを示せとことよさし祭りき格よさし祭りしくぬちに荒ぶる神たちよばかむと足にと足たまいに払いたまいてことといしはねきねたち草のかき場をもことやめて天の岩倉放ち雨の八重雲をいつのちわきにちわきで天下しよさし祭りき格よさし祭りしよもの国中と大山と日高神の国を靖国と定め祭りて下つい羽に宮柱ふとしきたて高間の原にちぎたかしりてすめみまのみことの水のみあらかつかえ祭りて天の御影日の御影とかくりまして靖国と平けくしろを示さむくぬちになりでむ雨のます人らが過ちをかしけむぐさぐさの罪ごとは天包み国包みここだけの罪でむ隠いでば天つ宮ごと持ちて天つ金木を元打ち切り末打ち立ちてしぐらの置き蔵に置きたらはして天つ菅そを元借り立ち末借り切りてやはりに取り裂けて天つのりとのふとのりとごとを乗れかく乗れば天つ神は雨の岩戸を押し開きて雨の八重雲をいつのちわきにちわきてきこしめさむ国つ神は高山の末引き山の末に登りまして高山のいほり引き山のいほりをかき分けてきこしめさむかくきこ示してば罪という罪はあらじとしなどの風の雨の八重雲を吹き放つことのごとく明日の右り夕べの右りを朝風夕風の吹き払うことのごとくおつべによるお船をへとき放ちてお海原に押し放つことのごとく落ち方の刺激が元焼き釜の戸釜持ちて打ち払うことのごとく残る罪はあらじと払えたまい清めたまうことを高山の末引き山の末より咲くなだりに落ちたきつ早川のせにますせおりつ姫という神お海原に持ちでなむ角持ちいでいなば荒潮の潮の八百字の八潮字の八重にます早きつ姫という神持ちかかのみてむ角かかのみてばいぶきどにますいぶきど主という神根の国そこの国にいぶき放ちてむ角いぶき放ちてば根の国そこの国にます早さすらいめという神持ちさすらい失いてむ角さすらい失いてば罪という罪はあらじと払えたまい清め山をこと天つ神国つ神八百万の神たちと共にきこしめせと申す。Unlike a church, mosque, or temple, shrines do not host funerals or burials. Dead bodies and the tasks associated with them are considered to be kegare, or impure, and thus not appropriate for a shrine. This is of course not to imply any coldness or disinterest in the deceased and his family. Before the advent of Buddhism, Japanese hosted funerals privately at their own homes. Today, the vast majority of Japanese funerals are Buddhist affairs. Buddhism, with its importance on impermanence and transience, has never feared staring death in the face, as it were, and so it was natural for Buddhist institutions to fill this area where shrines did not. Weddings at shrines, however, are common. One side note, modern Shintou is remarkably open-minded and willing to accept all those who come with open hearts. However, like all religious traditions, it has had its negative sides. And one of these is the idea of kegare coming to fuel the discrimination of so-called burakumin. This is a prejudicial term used to refer to those who were said to inherently have kegare, usually those who worked in businesses associated with death. Examples include not only those who kill for a career, like executioners, butchers, and tanners, but even those who simply have contact with dead bodies, like gravediggers and cremators. Still, I think most modern Shinto practitioners would say that the kegare associated with any profession are purified at a shrine as much as any other, that it's not our business to pry and probe, and that we should leave these things between the kami and their worshippers. We should all have an attitude of humility in the shrine and carry that into our daily lives. This is at least what I have heard from talking to Japanese about this touchy subject to the degree that I have, and I believe that it is certainly the correct attitude. Shinto has no one central canon of holy texts like a Bible or Tripitaka, but it is a faith which is rich in myths and stories of old. In this sense, it is comparable to the faith of the ancient Greeks and Romans. What is distinctive, however, is how intertwined these myths are to the national history of Japan and its land. The Greek and Roman myths occupied a fairly distinct realm from their study of factual history. Not so in Japan. The most authoritative canons of these myths come from two histories that were commissioned in the early 8th century or around then, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. The two purport to tell the story of Japan from the beginning of time to the time of their writing. However, these histories were imperially commissioned and intended to provide a unified history of the country. They have roots in a lot of local traditions, some of which can appear quite distinct. There are a lot of mythological strands in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, and I will not attempt to be comprehensive here, but merely introduce the most famous ones about the kami that are most important. Every mythology has to set up its in the beginning story. In Shinto, we begin with 3 kami who appear and then give birth to 7 generations of kami after them. Do not be biased from a Christian perspective to assume that these first 3 kami are inherently more worthy or supreme because they appeared first. In fact, these early kami are not discussed or venerated in Shinto all that often. But for the record, they are named Ame no Minakanushi no Kami, Takami Musubi no Kami, and Kami Musubi no Kami. The first truly famous kami are the last of the 7 generations descended from these 3 primordial kami. And they are the brother and sister pair of Izanagi no Mikoto, the male, and Izanami no Mikoto, the female. At the time of their creation, the earth is an unstructured mass that floats like oil on the ocean. Izanagi and Izanami use a heavenly spear to churn up the ocean until lands form. The first to emerge is an island named Onogoro. There are varied claims for this island today, mostly in the Seto Inland Sea. Izanagi and Izanami mate and give birth to a whole bevy of other kami, as well as the physical landforms of the earth. There is not an explicit cosmology spelled out in the Kojiki or Nihon Shoki, but there are some realms referred to which seem to have boundaries that are spiritual and not merely physical. Takamagahara, the plane of high heaven, literally translated. This is a celestial abode of various kami. We should again not be misled by a Christian bias that makes us think that the kami here are somehow superior to the ones below them. But it is certainly described as a marvelous, beautiful place. Next, Ashihara no Nakatsukuni, or the Central Land of Reed Plains. This is an ancient title for Japan. There are many names and epithets to refer to the lands now known as Japan in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, but the most common is the Central Land of Reed Plains. The ancient texts are of course limited to Japan when discussing the earthly realm, with some minor discussion of Silla or Korea and China. Yomi is the underworld or land of the dead. The etymology behind the word Yomi is uncertain. The kanji, which literally means yellow springs, is actually adopted from the Chinese equivalent of an underworld, and therefore doesn't literally spell out Yomi in any way. In any case, though, Yomi is a dark and gloomy underground area which seems to be quite similar to the pre-Christian conceptions of the underworld in Greece. Nenokuni, another name for a sort of netherworld. The name's etymology literally means land of roots, which implies that it is underground. Sometimes this is taken as an alternate epithet of Yomi, but it is unclear. And Tokoyo no Kuni, literally the land of eternity. Descriptions of this land are the most obscure, but general interpretation is that it seems to refer to a paradisical other realm, or Elysian fields of sorts, though not necessarily an afterlife, where people live in eternal youth. Some have later identified it with the legendary island of Mount Penglai in Chinese mythology, known as Horai in Japanese. Izanami ultimately dies when giving birth to a kami of fire named Kagutsuchi no Kami, who burns up her insides. Izanagi is furious, and in retaliation he slays Kagutsuchi. It is with this that the world first knows death and violence, and Izanagi is deeply distraught by it. So he descends into Yomi, the underworld, to look for his sister Izanami and bring her back to the surface. This myth plays on the universal theme of a entry into and return from the underworld, as we see in myths of figures like Orpheus and Inanna, although the story isn't quite the same as them. Izanagi succeeds in finding his sister, but she tells him that she is unable to return to the surface as she has already eaten the food of the underworld. Izanagi has been talking to Izanami, but has been unable to see her in the dark, so he lights a fire. He is then horrified when he sees her form, which is rotten and decomposing. Izanami is just as afraid at the shame of having her unsightly form uncovered, so in retaliation, Izanami sends a bevy of unsavory denizens of Yomi to attack Izanagi. These include kami of storms and thunder, warriors, and ugly hags. Izanagi, however, manages to evade them by taking off the cord and comb from his hair and throwing them back. The cord turns into grapes, and the comb turns into bamboo shoots. Then pursuers stop to eat these. It's notable that in these myths, sometimes the kami are described as having jewelry or similar accessories, when in much of Japanese history, until being reintroduced by the West, we don't see a lot of figures wearing things like necklaces or earrings. However, we do see that kind of accessory in the Jomon civilizations of prehistoric sites, which might hint that these myths date back to those times. Izanagi manages to barely escape, and he finally reaches the entrance to Yomi. He narrowly escapes by taking some peaches from a nearby tree and throwing them back towards his pursuers. While the pursuers are distracted, he seals off the entrance to the underworld with a large boulder. This entrance is apparently located in what used to be Izumo province and is today the western part of Shimane prefecture. From behind the boulder, he hears the voice of Izanami shouting in rage that she will kill 1,000 people every day in retaliation. And Izanagi says he will give birth to 1,500 people every day in that case, so that life will continue going. Izanagi has come into contact with death, with decay, with disgust, with fear, and with rage. In other words, he has come into contact with kegare, or impurification, for the first time. Therefore, he performs the first misogi, or purification, as well. He purifies himself by immersing himself in a river in Himuka province, which is today Miyazaki prefecture. The most common Norito in Shinto alludes to this very first purification, and as it is the model for all Shinto practice, it sets the model for all purification to come. When we purify ourselves, we attempt to recreate this original action to whatever degree we can. Many kami are born from Izanagi during this misogi, but the three most important are Amaterasu Omikami, born from washing his left eye, Tsukuyomi no Mikoto, born from washing his right eye, and Susanoo no Mikoto, born from washing his nose. Izanagi no Mikoto then allots the world to these three descendants, Amaterasu Omikami, Tsukuyomi no Mikoto, and Susanoo no Mikoto. Amaterasu is granted domain over Takamagahara, the plane of high heaven. She is the kami of the sun. Tsukuyomi is granted domain over the night. He is the kami of the moon. And Susanoo is granted domain over the seas. At this point, Tsukuyomi more or less drops out of the accounts of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. But even though he doesn't have the same colorful stories about him, he is considered equally august as his sister and brother. It's interesting how in Japan, the kami of the sun is female and kami of the moon is male, when it is the opposite way in many Western mythological systems. Amaterasu Omikami reigns over Takamagahara, and Tsukuyomi no Mikoto over the night with no problems. Susanoo no Mikoto, however, is distraught by the death of his mother and refuses to do his duty of reigning over the seas. Izanagi expels him for his refusal of his task. The despondent Susanoo then ascends to Takamagahara on the condition that he wishes to see his sister Amaterasu. But Amaterasu is suspicious and goes out to meet him wearing armor. Susanoo protests his innocence and endeavors to prove it by means of an ukei. This section can be pretty obscure and hard to follow, but ukei pretty clearly refers to a form of divination that involves taking an oath. In the case of Susanoo and Amaterasu, the two perform this oath divination by each taking an object of the other's, chewing it up, and spitting it out. Amaterasu chews up and spits out Susanoo's sword, whereupon 5 male kami are born. Susanoo chews up and spits out Amaterasu's Magatama bead, whereupon 3 female kami are born. A quick note, Magatama refers to a specific kind of decorative bead that is shaped like a kama and usually made out of jade. Prehistoric Jomon-era sites reveal that these were very common regalia on jewelry, so they clearly have an ancient importance in Japan. However, whatever meaning they had in Jomon culture is something we can only speculate. These are still often sold as charms at shrines today. Also, the 3 female kami born from Susanoo here are enshrined at the 3 parts of the Munakata Shrine Complex in Fukuoka Prefecture. Apparently, by producing female kami, Susanoo has won the trial. This is the part that's a bit hard to follow. In any case, he goes absolutely nuts after winning. He wreaks havoc and makes a mess of everything in Takamagahara, filling in all the rice fields and defecating in the halls. He finally crosses the line when he breaks a hole in the top of the weaving hall of Amaterasu's celestial palace and throws a horse through it which he had flayed alive. One of the weavers is so shocked that she inadvertently hits her genitals with a weaving shuttle and dies. Amaterasu is furious and flees Takamagahara in anger. Amaterasu hides in a cave known as Amano Iwato, sealing it with a boulder. This cave is in an area called Takachiho in Miyazaki Prefecture, by the way. As Amaterasu is the kami of the sun, the world was deprived of sunlight and cast into total darkness. This could not continue for long. In an effort to restore light to the world, a whole retinue of kami march up to the cave to urge her to come out. Their leader is Omoi Kane no Kami, a kami of wisdom and intelligence. The kami uproot some sakaki trees and bring them to the cave. They attach Magatama beads to them, as well as a bronze mirror. Other kami begin to dance and stamp around in fury, becoming divinely possessed. They do so in an attempt to get the attention of Amaterasu in the cave and cause her to emerge. Eventually, Amaterasu Omikami slides the boulder away to peek out from the cave, and the world is lit up once more with her radiance. At that moment, the mirror is presented before her. She sees herself in the mirror, her first experience with a mirror, and so is confused and beguiled by her reflection, believing it to be another kami. She nears the mirror and is pulled out of the cave, which is then immediately sealed with a shimenawa. Lots of important iconography in Shinto date to this event. Sakaki trees are considered holy for their role in this rite. The dancing ritual is also supposed to be the origin of the sacred Kagura dance. Note that in the original text of the Kojiki, it's described as pretty wild and perhaps sexual, as the main dancer exposes her breasts and pulls her skirt down to her genitals. It was, after all, meant to sound like the other kami were having a happy time in Amaterasu's absence. Lastly, a Magatama bead and the mirror from the tree are today 2 of the Sanshu no Jingi, or 3 sacred treasures. These 3 objects are owned by the Japanese imperial family, and their locations are kept strictly secret. They are never shown outside of the ceremony where a new emperor ascends the throne and is presented them. This ceremony has existed since the year 690 AD. The objects are never seen outside of ceremonial boxes in public, but only by the emperor himself and a few kannushi of particularly high rank. The 3rd of these treasures will be discussed shortly. Susanoo is in the end expelled from Takamagahara for his misbehavior. He then takes the central land of Reed Plains as his home, specifically the land of Izumo. He asks a kami of food named Ogetsuhime no Kami for food. In response, she expels food from her mouth, nose, and anus. Susanoo is disgusted and kills her in response. Her corpse provides the ground for many crops, which are all staples of Japanese agriculture. To be specific, these are silkworms, rice, millet, adzuki, wheat, and soybeans. Susanoo's last major exploit is to save his wife, Kushinada-hime, from an 8-headed serpent called Yamata no Orochi, which is terrorizing the land of Izumo. Upon smiting the serpent, he finds a sword inside of it, which is named Ame no Murakumo no Tsurugi. The most magnificent swords in Japanese history and folklore always have names of their own. He presents the sword as a gift to Amaterasu as a way to make peace and ask for forgiveness. One might say as a method of harae. And this sword, by the way, is the last of the 3 sacred treasures. Some historical accounts say that it was lost at sea in 1185 during a sea battle, but most say either that the one present at sea was a copy, or even that it was the original, but managed to miraculously reappear on land afterwards. The narrative of the Kojiki shifts focus to one of Susanoo no Mikoto's progeny, Okuninushi no Kami. It's not exactly certain if Okuninushi is Susanoo's son, grandson, or even further down the line. Okuninushi no Kami has 80 older brothers, all of whom long to marry a female kami named Yakami Hime. She lives in the land of Inaba, which is next to Izumo, the dwelling place of Susanoo and his progeny. Today, Inaba makes up the eastern side of Tottori Prefecture. One day, Okuninushi joins all 80 of his brothers on a trek to ask for Yakami Hime's hand in marriage. That will be quite a competition. It just so happens that they run across a hare on the way. This hare had earlier been up to some mischief. He wished to pass from the coast of Inaba to an island out at sea. This island has since been identified as one of the Oki Islands off the coast of Shimane Prefecture. In order to find a way across, he challenges a group of sharks. The term used here is wani, which today is the word for crocodile in Japanese. Sometimes this word seems to be used as a kind of sea dragon monster, but in this case it seems to be describing sharks. The hare challenges all the sharks and all the hares to line up from head to toe in 2 lines in order to see whose clan is larger. When all the sharks have lined up, the hare runs across them to the Oki Islands, using them as a land bridge. He then boasts of his cleverness and reveals to all the sharks how he has duped them. In retaliation, they maul him and rip all his fur off. It is at this point that the flayed hare meets Okuninushi and his brothers. He is in pain and asks what he should do. The brothers, feeling cruel, tell him to wash himself in the ocean and dry himself in the wind. He does so, but this only makes his pain worse. The brothers laugh at his gullibility. Okuninushi, however, is compassionate. He recommends the hare to bathe in fresh water at the mouth of a river and to roll in the pollen of gama, or cattails. Upon doing so, the body of the hare reverts to its original state. It turns out that this hare was a kami in disguise. This kami then tells Okuninushi that he is the one destined to have Yakami Hime's hand in marriage, presumably as proof of his good nature. Okuninushi's brothers are furious at this and make attempts on Okuninushi's life. Okuninushi hides from them in Nenokuni, the other netherworld besides Yomi. This is the best description we have of Nenokuni in the Kojiki, but it is not particularly detailed. There seem to be a lot of insects and reptiles, which along with the etymology of the name, meaning land of roots, is the only hint we have that it is perhaps underground. This land is in fact ruled over by Okuninushi's forebear Susanoo. While in Nenokuni, Okuninushi falls in love with one of Susanoo's daughters, Suseri Bime no Mikoto. When Susanoo discovers their illicit affair, he sentences Okuninushi to 4 trials to prove his worth. In the first trial, Okuninushi must sleep overnight in a snake house, presumably some room filled with snakes. Suseri Bime gives Okuninushi a snake scarf, which apparently he waves to keep the snakes away. The second trial is essentially a repeat of the first, but it is a centipede and wasp house instead, and the item he receives is a centipede and wasp scarf. For the third trial, Susanoo shoots an arrow into a plane of grass and asks Okuninushi to find the arrow and bring it back. While Okuninushi is searching, Susanoo sets the field on fire. However, a mouse in the field approaches Okuninushi and leads him around the fire, as well as showing him where the arrow is located. The last trial is strange. Susanoo asks Okuninushi to pick the lice and centipedes out of his hair. Suseri Bime gives Okuninushi some berries that he chews on. Susanoo is deceived by this and believes that the sound of him chewing the berries is Okuninushi chewing and spitting out the insects he picks out of Susanoo's hair. Susanoo feels comfortable by this and falls asleep while he's being groomed. But while he's asleep, Okuninushi ties his hair to the rafters of the room and blocks the door with a large boulder and escapes. Okuninushi and Suseribime flee together. Okuninushi takes Susanoo's sword, koto, and bow and arrow with him. Upon awakening, Susanoo grudgingly gives Okuninushi his blessing as the ruler of the central land of Reed Plains. It is at this point that Okuninushi receives his name, Okuninushi no Kami, literally meaning Master of the Great Land. Before this point in the legend, he was named Onamuji no Kami, but I've referred to him with one name for ease of understanding. With Susanoo's arsenal, he effortlessly defeats the 80 brothers who still are out for him, and becomes the ruler of the central land of Reed Plains. Upon Okuninushi no Kami's triumph over his brothers, a tiny kami appears riding on the crest of the waves and arrives on the shore. This kami is riding in a boat made of a tiny bean pod. The kami will not speak his name, nor can anyone identify him, save a kami of wisdom named Kuebiko, who appears in the form of a scarecrow. Kuebiko identifies this small kami as Sukuna Bikona no Kami, a son of Kami Musubi no Kami, one of the 3 first kami to come into existence at the beginning of the Kojiki. Sukuna Bikona no Kami aids with the establishment of the country, but in the end crosses over to the mysterious Tokoyo no Kuni. Another kami called Omononushi no Kami aids Okuninushi and is enshrined in Mount Mimoro in Yamato Province, which is modern-day Mount Miwa in Nara Prefecture. The central land of the Reed Plains is decided to be in need of a pacification, possibly of a violent variety, since it is full of evil and unruly kami. We here see how the unification of the many peoples and traditions of the Japanese archipelago under one emperor is perhaps being reflected in the myth. Okuninushi has not succeeded on his own in subjugating the lands. Amaterasu Omikami decides that a kami should be sent down from Takamagahara to do the job, and the candidates are among the sons born from the Ukei ritual when Susanoo chewed and spit out her Magatama beads. One son, Ame no Oshihomimi no Mikoto, is nominated, but he is afraid and refuses to even descend. A second, Ame no Hohi no Mikoto, is sent, but ends up currying favor with Okuninushi instead. 3 years pass with no sign of him having accomplished his mission. The last of the 3 sons, Ame no Wakahiko, is sent, but he ends up marrying Okuninushi's daughter, Shitateru Hime, and follows the same pattern as Ame no Hohi no Mikoto. 8 years pass with no sign of him having accomplished his mission. The kami in Takamagahara give him a sign by sending a pheasant down which will accuse him of not doing his duty. When Ame no Wakahiko sees this pheasant, he shoots it with an arrow. The arrow passes through the bird and ascends all the way to Takamagahara. The kami who find it there recognize it as one of Ame no Wakahiko's arrows. A kami named Takami Musubi, one of the 3 primordial kami, throws the arrow back down to earth, saying that it should spare Ame no Wakahiko if that arrow was in fact shot during the pacification of unruly kami, but that if it was not, it should kill Ame no Wakahiko himself. The arrow returns to earth and pierces Ame no Wakahiko through the chest. A funeral is then held for Ame no Wakahiko. This section provides an interesting glimpse at pre-Buddhist funeral customs in Japan. A mourning house is built around the corpse, which seems to be where the body is kept before it is buried. This was before Buddhism entered the archipelago, so there was no cremation yet. For 8 days and 8 nights, there is a vigil of sorts where loved ones come and visit the body before it is buried. At this time, Shitateru Hime's brother, with a very long name, Ajihika Takahikone no Kami, visits. When that happens, the mother and father of Ame no Wakahiko mistake Ajihiki Takahikone for Ame no Wakahiko, and cheer that their son is in fact still alive. When that happens, Ajihiki Takahikone is enraged and starts to destroy the mourning house. To us, this seems like a very strange reaction, but you must remember the idea of kegare. Ajihiki Takahikone was offended because he was being compared to an impure and unclean dead body, which was the height of insult for a kami. A new kami is then sent on the mission of subjugating the country. This one, Takemikazuchi no Kami, is a kami of thunder and certainly not one to mess with. This kami wastes no time in challenging Okuninushi to relinquish the right to rule to a kami from Takamagahara. Okuninushi lets his sons decide if they should accept the decree or challenge it. One of Okuninushi's sons, Koto Shironushi no Kami, decides that it would be wrong to challenge the decree of Takamagahara and accepts the reign of the heavenly kami. Another son, Takemi Nakata no Kami, refuses to give in and challenges Takemi Kazuchi to a test of strength. Some say that this test of strength is actually the origin of sumo wrestling, which, as mentioned before, is a Shinto rite in its original state. However, in the test of strength, Takemi Nakata is defeated. He flees to Lake Suwa in Shinano Province, modern-day Nagano Prefecture, and surrenders there. Okuninushi then relinquishes control of the land, only asking for a shrine to be built in his honor. This is the origin of Izumo Taisha in Shimane Prefecture, and Suwa Taisha in Nagano Prefecture is dedicated to Takemi Nakata. These are two of the oldest and most sacred shrines in Japan. Takemi Kazuchi then returns to Takamagahara. The central land of Reed Plains has now been officially sanctioned to the kami in Takamagahara, but the problem of who to nominate as its ruler reemerges. The first son of Amaterasu Omikami, who is too afraid, Ame no Oshihomimi no Mikoto, once again is chosen, but he offers his son to go in his place. This son is named Hikoho no Ninigi no Mikoto. He is officially sanctioned as the ruler of the central land of Reed Plains, and makes his descent along with a retinue of some other kami. A kami of the earth named Sarutabiko no Kami welcomes him. When Ninigi descends, he is given the three sacred treasures of the sword, mirror, and Magatama. All the emperors of Japan claim descent from Ninigi, meaning ultimately from Amaterasu and the kami in Takamagahara, and have kept these sacred treasures as proof of it. Ninigi makes his descent in Takachiho in Himuka Province, modern-day Miyazaki Prefecture. This is the same area where his grandmother, Amaterasu Omikami, hid herself in a cave in the past. Much of the story has focused on Izumo and the western coast of Japan in recounting Susanoo and his descendants. Now we shift to Miyazaki again as the origin of the imperial line. Some interpret this as rival traditions of Shinto that the Kojiki attempts to chart the competition of. Upon his descent, Hikoho no Ninigi no Mikoto sees a beautiful female kami named Konohana no Sakuyabime, whose name translates to Princess of the Flowering Trees. She explains that she is a daughter of a kami of mountains named Oyamatsumi no Kami. Ninigi seeks to marry her, and Oyamatsumi is delighted and eagerly sends her off. He in fact sends two of his daughters to marry Ninigi, Konoha no Sakuyabime, and her sister Iwanaga Hime, whose name translates to Princess of the Enduring Rocks. However, Iwanaga Hime is very ugly, and so Ninigi rejects her and sends her back. When this happens, however, Oyamatsumi is disappointed. The meaning behind the sisters' names is now revealed. With these two daughters, Ninigi's rule would be as eternal as the rocks and as flourishing and brilliant as the flowering trees. However, as he has only married Konohana no Sakuyabime, his rule will be as brilliant as the flowering trees, but also as transient and temporary as them. This curse is why Ninigi's descendants, the emperors of Japan, are now mortals and have normal lifespans. Konohana no Sakuyabime conceives after only one night of mating. Ninigi is thus incredulous and refuses to believe that it is his child. To prove her fidelity, however, Konohana no Sakuyabime makes an oath that if her child is of an earth kami, it would be an inauspicious birth, but if it was of a heavenly kami, it would be an auspicious birth. She creates a sealed hut to give birth in and sets it on fire before the moment of birth. It seems as though doing this is supposed to prove that the child is a heavenly kami, as to survive the birth in the midst of the fire would be auspicious. Konohana no Sakuyabime gives birth to 3 children. Their names are Hoderi no Mikoto, Hosuseri no Mikoto, and Hoori no Mikoto. Of the 3 offspring, Hosuseri no Mikoto drops out of the myth cycle, but Hoderi no Mikoto and Hoori no Mikoto become accomplished masters of the sea and of the mountains, respectively. Hoderi is an excellent fisherman, and Hoori is an excellent hunter. This division, and almost we could call it competition between seas and mountains, is an ancient theme in Shinto, reflecting this original struggle. The 2 brothers decide to change places and see if they retain their luck. Hoori uses his brother's fishhook in the sea, but he drops it in the water and loses it. The two brothers then meet. Hoderi reports that he was unsuccessful as a hunter, and that the two should stay in the positions that suit them best. But Hoori has to report that he lost Hoderi's fishhook. He offers up to 500 other fishhooks in compensation, but Hoderi is still upset. He wants his original one back at all costs. We see an animist belief at work here. The hook had a kami of its own, so it cannot be replaced by just any other old hook. Hoori no Mikoto then goes back out to the sea, searching for the fishhook. He doesn't find it, but another kami named Shiotsuchi no Kami directs him to a path that leads to the palace of Watatsumi no Kami, also known as Ryujin. This kami is the master of the sea and has the form of a dragon. The palace of Watatsumi no Kami is gorgeous and shimmering, with walls that resemble the scales of fish. Hoori is spotted by the daughter of Watatsumi, Toyotama Hime. The two immediately fall in love. Hoori then forgets all about his original mission of finding the hook and lives with Toyotama Hime in Watatsumi's palace for 3 years. But Hoori slowly starts to miss his life on the surface and appears sad for the first time. When Watatsumi asks why he seems upset, Hoori explains his situation. Watatsumi helps by summoning all the fishes of the sea and asks if any of them has seen the hook. One fish, a tai or sea bream, turns out to be the one that has Hoderi's hook stuck in its throat. Watatsumi then takes the hook out and gives it to Hoori, along with 2 magical jewels, one of which raises the tides and the other of which ebbs them. Watatsumi implores Hoori to use these jewels to subdue his brother. From at least my reading, it's little unclear why now Hoori has to do battle with Hoderi when he has his hook, but the two seem to have become rivals in their time apart. Hoori returns to the surface on the back of a wani. Again, if this is a shark or crocodile or a dragon, it's a little unclear, because this word is always a bit hard to interpret in these old texts. But Hoori defeats Hoderi and claims the land. Toyotama Hime then also follows her husband to the land, and she is pregnant with his child. A birthing house is constructed for her. It seems as though temporary houses are made for both births and deaths at points in this story, perhaps reflecting an ancient Japanese practice. The house is thatched with cormorant feathers. Toyotama Hime implores Hoori not to look at her while she is giving birth. He breaks his promise and looks anyway, and he is shocked because he sees that during her birth, Toyotama Hime has reverted to her true form, a wani. In this case, probably a dragon. She is ashamed and furious, so she dives back into the ocean and is never seen again. However, the child she bore remains with Hoori, and this child is named Ugaya Fukiaezu no Mikoto. Ugaya Fukiaezu no Mikoto gives birth to a son, whose lengthy name is given as Kamu Yamato Iwarebiko no Mikoto. However, he is better known as the first emperor of Japan, Emperor Jimmu. This is the first figure in the Kojiki who is given explicit dates. His reign is said to have begun in 660 BC. This is considered the true founding of the nation of Japan, not merely the central land of reed plains. It is said that the date of foundation was February 11th, which is still a holiday called National Foundation Day in Japan today. In the Meiji period, a custom emerged of setting this foundation as the beginning date in their calendar, in the same manner as the birth of Christ in the Gregorian calendar or the Hijra in the Islamic calendar. This has become associated with militarism and quickly was suppressed after World War II, but it is still used in a Shintou context. So if you want to know the Japanese imperial year, just add 660 to the Gregorian year. 2025 is 2685, for example. Emperor Jimmu was born in Takachiho in Miyazaki Prefecture. However, he moved up through the Seto Inland Sea, Naniwa, meaning Osaka, and landed on the Kii Peninsula. At this point, Emperor Jimmu spots a 3-legged crow called Yatagarasu. This crow itself was a kami sent by Takami Musubi in Takamagahara. The crow guides him inwards to Yamato Province, which is modern-day Nara Prefecture. It is here that Emperor Jimmu settles, and for the first time, ascends the throne. This represents the foundation of the Japanese state and the imperial line. This place, then, Nara, is where the earliest capital of Japan was located, until the imperial capital moves to Kyoto in the Heian period, and the government capital later moves to Kamakura and Edo. or Tokyo. Emperor Jimmu is said to be buried near Mount Unebi in Kashihara in Nara Prefecture today. With the reign of Emperor Jimmu, the Kojiki shifts tone to reading more like the annals or chronicles of other countries. This is not to say that more fantastical elements disappear. Myth and history are deeply intertwined in Shinto, but the style of the Kojiki now shifts to recording the reigns of the emperors, and some of these are more eventful than others. For this point, I will refrain from spelling out all the interesting points from the 1,000 or so years between the reign of Emperor Jimmu and the writing of the Kojiki, as my point here is more to give readers an overview of the main kami and mythological foundations of Shinto, not a complete history of Japan. As I have mentioned, there is not a canon of proscribed metaphysical beliefs in Shinto, but there are some teachings that certain Shinto masters have given us which are worth considering and studying, even if we should not take them as official dogma to the tradition as a whole. The term Ichirei Shikon literally translates to one spirit, four souls. As I have explained, Shinto is a form of animism that affirms the existence of spirits, or kami, within everything. But to get more granular, what that exactly looks like is a singular so-called spirit which consists of four souls. This theory affirms the existence of something like a spirit or soul. In this sense, it could possibly be interpreted as one area that Shinto is explicitly at odds with Buddhism, which claims that there is no such thing as a self or soul, quite credibly in my opinion. However, the soul described in Shinto is inherently compound and plural, not singular. In that sense, it very much does not resemble the traditional image of a soul in the Western or ancient Indian Vedic sense. So, I do think that this doctrine can be interpreted in a Buddhist way, just as the idea of aggregates making up a person were in India and in the Buddhist tradition. Now, we can sketch out what these four souls are. They are the Ara-mitama, Nigi-mitama, Sachi-mitama, and Kushi-mitama. Ara in Ara-mitama means wild, unruly, boisterous, and so on. Nigi in Nigi-mitama means harmonious, tranquil, peaceful, and so on. Sachi in Sachi-mitama means happy, joyous, glad, and so on. And Kushi in Kushi-mitama means mysterious, strange, sublime, and so on. Everything has these four souls, including the very universe itself. We are a microcosm of the whole. We can best understand the functions of these souls with the example of a human in this case. In a fully balanced, healthy, moral person, all four of these souls act harmoniously together and are not out of balance. To quote the teacher Yamakage Motohisa directly in his description of what these souls do in a human, the Ara-mitama is in charge of, quote, emotional operation of rigidity and hardening of the mind and heart, destructive consciousness, desire of materialistic expression, unquote. That is to say, the Ara-mitama is slightly boisterous and wild and instinctive, and potentially even a little, we might say, aggressive, which isn't understood as a bad thing necessarily. It can be very important for spiritual states sometimes to channel that power in a creative way. The Nigi-mitama is responsible for, quote, emotional operation of flexibility, the emotion of stagnation as well as driving desire, the emotion of feeling and touching, unquote. We can think of the Nigi-mitama then as the opposite. The first kanji here, Nigi, is translated as wa, and it's often used as a name for the Japanese state. Wa is an old term for Japan. It's in the kanji Yamato, which means Japanese, so this term means peaceful and Japanese, which is, it makes sense why the value of harmony and peace and maintaining tranquility is so valued in Japan, and this is seen as the soul that basically does that. The Sachi-mitama is responsible for, quote, the senses, passion, love, harmonious consciousness, desire to study or inquiry, unquote. The kanji here means happy, joyous, and glad, so it seems like this soul is connected to kind of morality and good cheer, but also a kind of intelligence. It's connected to what might be called kokoro in Japanese, which is translated sometimes as heart, but really means heart and mind. In Japan and China, they use the same word for what we might call heart in the sense of emotion and mind in the sense of thought, reason, and so on. And I think it's really better that these are seen as one. We divide them too much in the Western tradition. And then the last one, Kushimitama, is responsible for, quote, the desire to seek mystery, desire for creative contemplation, the ability of intuition and apperception, unquote. So the kanji here, kushi, literally means strange or unusual. And so this is seen as kind of the soul which is interested in what's mysterious, what's out there, and it's where a lot of our spiritual instincts land. They say that, like, people with special powers and ESP and stuff like that have a heightened Kushimitama. So in brief, we might say that Aramitama is physical, Nigimitama is emotional, Sachimitama is intellectual, and Kushimitama is spiritual. The Aramitama and Nigimitama are seen as manifest and to some degree material, while the Sachimitama and Kushimitama have something of a higher nature. And human beings are seen as an assemblage of these spirits, so we must ask what happens when we die. Yamakake Motohita teaches that the two material souls, the Aramitama and Nigimitama, decay along with the body. The Aramitama is what emits negative energy and causes kegare, or impurity, and death. And the Nigimitama is what stays behind for later worship and reverence and rituals of remembrance. It is not eternal, but it does have quite a long afterlife on the earth. The two higher souls, quote-unquote, the Sachimitama and Kushimitama, ascend to higher realms of kami, but must go through an interim state before they can be purified of earthly pollutants. Again, this is all Yamakake Motohisa's teaching, the latter part, but the Ichirei Shikon idea is seen in other Shinto traditions. And there are similarities to Chinese Taoist traditions as well. I can end this lecture by addressing a question some people might have, which is, can I become a Shintoist? Well, I think the question is formulated here entirely wrongly. Here we are speaking of Shinto as if it were Christianity or Islam, where an explicit conversion is necessary, as if we were to be interrogated for heresy. But there is nothing like that in Shinto. Some have in the past said that Shinto is an inherently ethnic religion, and that gaijin or foreigners can never really partake in it in the same way as Japanese. But this is not a rule. We are not prohibited from partaking in pretty much anything that goes on in a shrine as a matter of policy. And there has been at least one foreigner who has become an ordained kannushi in Japan, and there have been other foreign shrines built in places like San Marino and the west coast of the United States. But what does make Shinto bounded is the shrine. If you are not in the presence of a shrine, it's hard to call what you do Shinto. If you are in Japan, you should have no problem finding one. If not, things become harder. There are shrines scattered around many of Japan's former colonies in Asia, but due to the historical circumstances under which they were created, they usually have the opposite effect of evoking sadness and regret rather than the peace and serenity that shrines are supposed to evoke. One of the most unfortunate parts of the state Shinto apparatus turning Shinto ideology into one of holy war during World War II was the way that it closed the door for the peaceful expansion of Shinto in the manner of Buddhism. In the early 20th century, Japanese immigrants actually began creating shrines rather freely in the western United States, but these were almost all closed as the creation of Shinto establishments was outlawed during the war. In one example of the kind of lengths Japanese immigrants would do to show their being severed from Japanese ultranationalism, the spirit of George Washington was enshrined at the Daijingu Shrine in Honolulu as a show of solidarity. And while that example of George Washington being worshipped at a Shinto shrine might sound strange, I think it actually reveals a lot about how we should inherit and wield the spirit and teachings of Shinto, as gaijin unfortunate enough to not have a staffed shrine near us. For the upshot of this is that if you do not have a shrine near you, you have to make your own. Indeed, many Japanese have small household shrines called kamidana in their homes. While it would be ideal to have some object from Japan to at least tie it to the land in a distant way, for us it seems to be the next best thing. for Shinto predates the shrine, and most importantly is about living in accordance with nature and a desire to become pure along with it. And it's what I aim to do. And whether you can officially call what I do Shinto or not is a matter of debate, but it brings me a great amount of happiness and a sense of purpose, and that's ultimately what matters most.